My name is Still Waters, and these are my stories. I am an experiencer of the phenomenon, an empath, a lucid dreamer, and a high consciousness traveler of other dimensions and alternate timelines that make up our universe. Over the past several years, I have awakened to a state of consciousness that has allowed me to glimpse into my simultaneous lives occurring in this universe. Like pages of a notepad, these alternate timelines are contained and exist simultaneously as one. And like the ink from a felt-tipped pen, my higher consciousness bleeds into these timelines night after night to experience these alternate timelines of my life. I do not pretend to know the purpose of these high consciousness experiences, only that they happen to me every night in full detail, and have decided to start writing them down and sharing them. Step into my world of awakening and enlightenment that I call the Chronicles of Still Waters. The following high consciousness experience you are about to enjoy is called Armageddon Unleashed. Last night, I awakened in the dream state outside of my home. It was springtime and I was working in the backyard. The radio was playing in the garage, loud enough that I could clearly hear it as I worked. As I stood there familiarizing myself in the timeline that I had entered, my attention was promptly seized by a loud and unusual sight overhead. Living along the flight path used by commercial passenger aircraft, it was not uncommon to see low-flying aircraft overhead, preparing to land at the nearby airport. What captured my attention was that this was an enormous military aircraft, an American C-5M Super Galaxy, being escorted on either side by FA-18 fighter jets. I've never seen such a massive military aircraft before. On the side of the aircraft in bold black lettering, it said U.S. Air Force, with an American flag painted on the tail section of the plane. What on earth was the U.S. Air Force doing flying in Canadian airspace? And why was it preparing to land? As I stood, dumbfounded at the sight of this giant airframe flying overhead, I distinctly heard the news announcer reporting the news on the radio.
Breaking news out of Ottawa, as the Canadian government takes decisive action following yesterday's unprecedented attack on the United States. This morning, the Prime Minister invoked the War Measures Act, granting authorization for the deployment of Canadian armed forces across the nation, as well as granting full authority to United States military forces to enter Canada to assist in ongoing defensive operations. Meanwhile, in Washington, President Pence wasted no time denouncing the attack and swiftly signed an emergency declaration with congressional support and the approval of its NATO allies to establish full-spectrum dominance over North American airspace. Effective immediately, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, has launched its largest air defense operation to date, spanning from the Arctic Circle to South America, securing the skies over North America. The United States has also recalled half of its naval fleet from overseas deployments, redirecting them to establish defensive perimeters along the Pacific, Atlantic, and Arctic Oceans. NATO forces across Europe are currently being activated to support Canada and the U.S. in restoring stability to their largest members. And just moments ago, the United Nations Security Council convened an emergency meeting, passing a resolution, condemning the attack and pledging increased aid to address the crisis unfolding in the United States.
The radio announcer's voice was drowned out from the sound of the fighter jet's engines roaring overhead. They were much lower than what the regular air traffic normally flew as they made their final approach to land. I stood there in disbelief to what I was witnessing. What had been the arrival into an alternate timeline of a pleasant sunny afternoon was quickly taken over by a gut punch of uneasiness and worry. What event led to the decision to implement a no-fly zone across the entire continent's airspace? Watching the U.S. Air Force flying overhead with such a display of dominance in the sky was very unsettling to witness. Clearly, a serious attack had occurred in the United States to set in motion the largest military operation ever conducted in North America. Having just arrived in this alternate timeline, I thought that several major city centers in the United States must have been attacked that prompted such a commanding response. My initial thoughts were that this attack must have targeted the electrical power grid, a well-known weak point in any developed nation's infrastructure. It would not only incapacitate a country's ability to operate effectively, but would create a great deal of instability, confusion, and chaos within the population impacted by the blackouts. I did not know if a nuclear strike had just occurred, but considering the level of action taken by the American government, I could not rule that out either. Regardless of what occurred, I knew that millions of people were probably now without electricity for the unforeseeable future, and with the coming summer predicted to be one of the hottest on record, any cities hit in the southern regions of the United States would see many casualties and even deaths due to the damage done to the electrical power grid. An attack at this level was most definitely strategic in implementing significant damage with the least amount of effort to one of the most militarized nations in the world. The United States had been hit a decisive blow that would force them to focus a great deal of effort and resources in repairing the damage caused, as well as trying to assist the millions of Americans from the oncoming summer's heat. As I began slipping away from this alternate timeline, I tried my best to concentrate on remembering all the details I had observed. I knew this timeline was way too close to my waking life, and that I needed to try and remember as much of it as I could, so when I woke up I could write down the potential of this impending doom. When I awakened from the dream state, my mind was still reeling from the experience. In this waking timeline, the current president of the United States was Donald Trump. His vice president was Mike Pence. Did this mean this event in this alternate timeline might have a possibility of merging soon into my waking timeline? If Donald Trump was removed from office, by default, Mike Pence would become the president, and that made the possibility of this event an imminent reality. As I wrote down the event from this alternate timeline in my journal, so many questions of what I had experienced were flooding my mind. Who would have done such an attack? Why would they have done it? What was the end goal of these attacks? And were they considered a success by those who implemented them? My thoughts immediately pointed towards China as being the adversary behind the attacks. Done with exacting precision, maximum impact, and with little to no defendable action taken to prevent it from happening, this all pointed towards a country with the technological savvy and economic motives to undermine its biggest threat for global dominance. For decades, China has been considered one of the world's superpowers, the elephant in the room when it came to controlling the world economy, but it has always been under the thumb of the United States. China has always had to live in the shadow of the United States as being the #1 superpower in the world. The United States held the status of being the world police and claiming the right to intervene in other sovereign states around the globe with the approval of its NATO allies and the United Nations for many years. Perhaps China might have had enough of being #2 and wanted to change the landscape on the world stage without going to a war over it, undermining their sole adversary, which has hindered China's full exertion of influence and power on a geopolitical scale by incapacitating the delicate electrical grid infrastructure would be an obvious choice. Climate change had already reduced water reservoirs to critical levels, impacting hydroelectricity production. The added strain of demand for electricity during the summer was already putting a considerable amount of stress to the nation's electrical power grid. Triggering a massive outage with the use of an electromagnetic pulse weapon system was all that China needed to do to put the world's greatest nation into darkness and chaos for many months, if not years. Knocking over this first domino was all that would be required. Mother Nature would do the majority of the heavy lifting when it came to civilian casualties from such an attack, and would set into motion a homeland emergency crisis that would last for years. This would mean the United States' attention would be focused on their own people, and would ensure military resources would not be leaving their country to police the rest of the world, allowing China to finally take control over regions such as Taiwan, Southeast Asia, and even India, without anyone to stop them. The United States would be stretched too thin to do anything without leaving their country vulnerable to attack by its other adversaries in the world. With the United States shifting its attention on homeland security, the rest of the world's superpowers weren't in any position to step in to manage conflicts unfolding around the world, other than their representatives shouting in great disdain in the United Nations Security Council hearings, wearing pins in support of nations, hanging flags outside their homes in solidarity, and sending thoughts and prayers on social media platforms seemed to be everyone else's form of currency when it came to supporting victims of geopolitical conflicts in the world these days. For many months, these thoughts of worry would fill my head, and every spring I would cringe at the thought of going outside and having to wonder if that alternate timeline would merge into this waking timeline, and I would experience that moment again in my backyard. Some people consider déjà vu as simply the sensation of experiencing something that feels familiar, even though it's supposedly happening for the first time. I have learned through my extensive high consciousness experiences to alternate timelines that moments of déjà vu are actually the mile markers of when timelines intersect with each other and merge into one. They are a form of confirmation to one's consciousness in both timelines that they have merged into one, and results in that feeling or sensation of familiarity. When you experience déjà vu, it is a lot like when you smell the slightest hint of buttery popcorn in the air. At first, you aren't 100% sure if you are smelling popcorn, and then in the next inhalation, you get the full aromatic sensation of buttery popcorn that triggers the senses and confirms to you that it is indeed popcorn. Déjà vu tends to hit me like that, and once it does, there is no further confirmation needed to realize the merging of timelines has occurred. Over the following years, President Trump would eventually end his term in office. Mike Pence would also withdraw his campaign for the following presidential race, and that gave me a bit of relief knowing what I had witnessed in another timeline would most likely never merge into my waking life. I would find myself revisiting this alternate timeline on multiple occasions over the coming months and years, and that would allow me to observe, experience, and journal an Armageddon unleashed onto the world and the disintegration of our modern society as we know it. I would awaken numerous times into this alternate timeline to find myself wandering among the ashes of a shattered world. I have tried my best to journal these experiences in the hopes of heeding the warning from a timeline of how close we are to living in a devastated society, and what I have learned from it all. When I returned to this alternate timeline, I found myself standing amongst a formation of large boulders on top of a slightly elevated hill overlooking a vast prairie. The sky was overcast, giving the landscape a dull and less welcoming appearance. I was with a group of people and seemed to have entered this timeline in the middle of a heated argument within the group. We all looked to have been traveling on foot for some time. From the condition of my clothes and the mud on my boots, I'd say it had been a long time since they had seen the inside of a washing machine. I gathered rather quickly from the backpack I was carrying and how thin I was that obviously things had deteriorated since I last visited this timeline. I did not know how much time had passed since that incident I observed over my home and hearing that news report on the radio. All I knew was that it clearly appeared things had taken a turn for the worse. I found myself far away from my home, walking with a group of strangers. The argument that I found myself in was regarding a disagreement on which direction the group should continue our journey south. From what I gathered, we were traveling on foot with literally the clothes on our back and very little supply of food and water. We were heading south to escape the impending winter season. It was already fall, and by the condition of the foliage, it had to be around late September, early October. I had no clue how far we had already traveled, but there was clearly a sense of urgency to not delay our goal of getting further south. Our lives would depend on it. We had reached a transition in the topography, entering the Great Plains region of North America. This plane ran through the heart of North America and provided very little cover in regards to protection from those willing to kill vulnerable groups making their way south. Half the group wanted to stay in the forested region to the east. That route was much slower, but would provide us with more safer options for shelter and hunting for food. The other group wanted to stay on course due south through the Great Plains, as it guaranteed us the most direct and fastest route to warmer climate. But it also put us at greater risk of being attacked. Gone were the days of law and order in this world. With the debate showing no signs of coming to an agreement, some of the people began walking away, having made their own mind up on which direction they would be heading. The group started to splinter as more people began to leave, and those involved in the heated debate quickly realized their dissension was causing everyone to go their separate ways. I stood there observing a futile attempt at democracy unfolding before me. It was evident that people no longer had patience for any sort of diplomacy, as the world had shown us all that it failed to prevent the destruction of our modern society. I too did not feel any sense of loyalty to either side of this debate, and knew from that moment on I would be seeing many of these people for the last time. I had decided a long time ago, leaving Canada, that southwestern Colorado would be my destination if I survived the journey. It was probably for the best that I was on my own, having successfully crossed into the United States. Going on my own was probably a blessing in disguise. With less baggage to slow me down, I was able to pick up the pace and travel considerably faster. Along the way, I would find a bicycle abandoned on the side of the road. It had fallen into disrepair and had been discarded by its previous owner. Luckily, with my mechanical skills, I was able to cobble it back together and return it to working condition, except for a flat tire. Once I came across another discarded bicycle, I was able to salvage the parts I needed from that to complete the repairs to my bike. Now I was on a roll. Having the advantage of speed on my side, I began putting on the miles by traveling at night on the interstate highway. Riding in the darkness of night might have seemed dangerous, but riding on the painted center line would guide my way and allow me to keep from going off course. The number of miles I could travel at night far exceeded the distance I could travel on foot during the day, and it ensured I never had to sleep in the cold. I would prepare my route in the early evening on a road map by marking my planned course for the night and potential areas to watch out for, and slowly head out at dusk. Once night had fallen, I could pick up my pace, and by dawn I'd start to scout for a secluded place to sleep. Having the advantage of being able to rest during the day offered me more opportunities to scavenge and replenish my supplies, as well as sleep in the warmth during the daytime temperatures. I knew it was very dangerous for me to switch to traveling by night, but the priority at the time was all about making as much distance from the north before winter arrived. Resourcefulness would become a valuable trait in this post-apocalyptic world. Learning to utilize my ingenuity of having grown up on a farm as a child would pay much more dividends than any university degree. The challenges of growing up on a farm in a rural community provided me with valuable lessons that would serve me well now. In one experience in this alternate timeline, I recalled working on a farm. I do not know what led me to getting there, only that I had somehow made a deal with the people who had taken over an abandoned farming complex to help repair some of their equipment and provide manual labor in exchange for new clothes, a place to sleep, and a few meals before I continued my journey further south. Learning new means of survival meant adapting to the environments and situations that you would have never thought of. It wasn't enough to be equipped with a bug-out bag of emergency survival essentials. One also had to prepare for the possibility of being robbed. For instance, I learned when scavenging for food supplies that chewing gum was an overlooked source of energy and was lightweight and could be easily concealed in the linings of your clothes. It was an excellent emergency source of sustenance in the event you were robbed of your provisions or had the misfortune of being held captive. In desperate times, it could provide you with a hit of sugar to help you make it until your next meal, and its indefinite shelf life made it an easy choice for emergency rations, as well as a delicacy item for trading. Though much of the infrastructure remained intact, such as the roads and bridges I traveled on, the houses and buildings I would come across would tell a tale of unimaginable destruction and abandonment. What had happened to the world to put us into such hard times? Where did all the people go? And for those who remained like me, where were we all headed? As I would return to this alternate timeline repeatedly, some of my experiences were not as detailed or as clear to how far along I was on my journey. At one point, I recalled traveling with a group of at least 50 people, and we were on a mountainside. We had reached a ski lodge at the top of the mountain to stop for the night. Being in such a remote location, it was stocked with plenty of alcohol and food, and we were able to all indulge in a night of feasting and getting drunk. Making my way through this timeline, I found that I felt much more uneasy being involved with groups than being on my own. Trust was something you held onto a short leash in these times, and I had witnessed all too often the consequences of when people put their trust in the wrong individuals. In this era, alliances would unravel among good people at the slightest hint of uncertainty or doubt. It was difficult to try and discern what had happened in the world to cause all this chaos and the disintegration of modern society. Every time I would return to this alternate timeline, I tried my best to find clues to its destruction. The magazines and old newspapers I would come across in my travels provided me with no evidence as to what had happened. From that alone, I could only suspect that whatever transpired must have happened so suddenly that it was never documented in the media. The further along in this timeline, I found myself possessing military-grade weapons. I had a sidearm and a sniper rifle, and had grown very skilled at using both. Every time I would enter these later periods in this alternate timeline, I always felt I was on the run, being hunted or being chased and being in a fight with some other group. It appeared that I was in a territory where a group had established control of a region with a small town that had been converted into a centralized camp. They were capturing people and imprisoning them within this camp, and from what I gathered, I had made it my mission to undermine their roving squad's dominance in this region. Killing, it seemed, had been another trait I had also grown quite effective in doing. At one point of this conflict, I had been ambushed and captured. I realized I was outnumbered, outgunned, and defenseless to the trap I had walked into, and simply gave up. Surrendering without hesitation, I feel, saved my life. I knew there was a bounty on the head of any resistance fighters, and my captors celebrated in having successfully captured me. Seen as a bit of a well-known freedom fighter in the territory, I was paraded into the prison camp for everyone to see and placed in a steel cage located in the center of the complex. I think the significance of being put on display like that was, in a sense, done to demoralize the prisoners in the camp, that there was no escape from this place. Having been a loner, I did not know how much of a thorn I had been in the side of this militia. By the way I was being treated with kid gloves, I assumed there was a higher price earned for the bounty if the prisoners were not harmed or injured in the capture. I think that was done, so it would allow them a higher rate of success in trying to recruit skilled fighters into becoming part of their militia if they felt they were not a risk of resisting. I already knew that would never happen. I would rather die than to become a part of their operation of oppression. After years of living in this hell on earth, I was about done with fighting the good fight. Contemplating my life as I prepared to give up completely and welcoming my impending death, a little girl from one of the bunkhouses in the camp began walking towards me, holding a chunk of bread. She couldn't have been much older than 8 years old, and the guards did not see her as any type of threat. The guards did not stop her as she approached me. Her innocence and kind gesture were not a threat to anyone in this place. I could only assume her family were also prisoners in the camp. The little girl never said a word to me when she reached the cage I was in. She nervously extended the bread for me to take, and once I had a grasp of the bread, she let go of it and quickly ran back to the bunkhouse she had come from. Thankful for this morsel of food, I made a gesture of appreciation by raising it into the air to show my gratitude for the kindness bestowed upon me. Without hesitation, I broke the bread in two and was surprised to find a piece of paper hidden inside it. I quickly palmed the note into my hand, so as it would not be noticed by the guards. I slowly began to eat the bread. It was warm and savoring the hint of butter and salt in it was a delicacy I had not enjoyed in a very long time. As I slowly chewed on the simple meal, I was able to read the note I was given, and in the next bite, ingested the piece of paper to get rid of the contraband. At this point of my captivity, I had already resigned to the fact that I was giving up. There was no more fight left in me, and I was exhausted. I was tired of constantly looking over my shoulder and being on the run. I was tired of everything this world had offered me, and as I swallowed the contents of that message, tears welled up at the corners of my eyes, silently expressing the emotions deep within me. The message written on that piece of paper was concise and to the point. It read, "We are with you, brother, stay strong." Sitting in this miserable cage in self-pity and hoping for my death to come quickly, I was given a message of hope when I needed it the most. Hope not only from the prisoners in the camp, but a message of hope from a higher power that showed me that these people looked up to me as a leader in such dark times, and that my mere existence and fighting the good fight had given them all tremendous hope to hold on to from their imprisonment, that there was still a chance that one day they would all be free again. Humbled by this moment, I held that final piece of bread in the air, a silent testament to those who might be observing me from the bunkhouses in the camp. With a clenched fist raised high, I conveyed my unwavering determination to honor the message sent to me, ensuring those who relied on my leadership knew their trust was not misplaced. As I consumed the last morsel, tears welled up in my eyes, a bitter reminder of how close I had come to surrender. Knowing how these people looked up to me into leading them in their resistance meant my role in this timeline was not over. It became clear to me now that the struggle had only just begun. After that experience, I would return to this alternate timeline twice more. In both visits, I would arrive at a time that appeared to be much later since my capture and imprisonment. I did not know what happened or what had led me to this point in the timeline, but in both experiences, I would find myself in this enormous building. It appeared to be some sort of warehouse-sized vault. In it were rows upon rows of large wooden crates stored floor to ceiling, military vehicles such as Humvees, personnel carriers, cargo trucks, etc. The crates stored in the warehouse were labeled everything from food, clothing, medical first aid, firefighting equipment, pumps, fuel, drinking water, books, etc. It appeared to be some sort of massive emergency aid repository. In the first visit to this timeline, I was helping organize and prepare these items for long-term storage. Much planning and care went to ensuring all these items were prepared to be stored indefinitely and that they would be ready for use when they would be needed again. I recall taking a good look at the size of this facility, and it was as large as a hangar. The building itself was also heavily fortified, with unbelievable amounts of state-of-the-art climate-controlled air purification systems and sensors throughout the facility to protect its contents from being damaged. This was in fact being set up like an emergency time capsule. My last visit to this timeline, I would arrive at the moment that this emergency cache facility was being put into hibernation to be sealed. I recall standing in the command center of the facility and watching the massive doors being closed for the last time. There was a team of people monitoring the progress of the operation of sealing the building, as well as preparing for the long-term monitoring of the emergency cache. The facility that I appeared to be working at was transitioning from emergency operational status back to sentry duty of this facility, and the feeling that I got from this moment was that there was a sense of relief that this was the end to this Armageddon, and an era of a new time of peace had returned. This appeared to be the end of me visiting this timeline. For weeks following these last high consciousness experiences visiting this timeline, I often wondered what had happened to our civilization to have caused this to happen in the first place. I was looking for the answers as to how we went from living in our current way of life to surviving on the land, and fighting one another for crumbs. One night, I would finally get my answer. While in the dream state, I was met by a group of beings. They appeared to me in the form of orbs. I could sense their presence and could feel their individuality or soul from each of the orbs before me. They spoke to me telepathically and said they heard me calling to know what happened and felt the worry and fear that had consumed me from these experiences. They wanted to provide me with the opportunity to experience this Armageddon that was unleashed on the world. What was odd about their gesture was, they asked if I would prefer to be asleep while it happened, or if I wanted to observe the event and be pulled from harm just seconds before the end. Confused by their options, I chose the latter, because how would I know what happened if I didn't witness it? They granted my request, and at that moment I was placed into the timeline once more. At this part of the timeline, I was with my friend working in a garage on an old muscle car. We were located in the city north of my home, and outside there were various homes, tall apartment buildings, and trees all around the neighborhood. As we both stood outside the opened garage door, we heard people screaming in panic, and people were running everywhere. There were a few cars racing down the street, and having known what was unfolding in front of me, I knew that I was observing the end of our civilization as we knew it. I knew there was nothing that could be done to stop it or evade its destruction, as these beings had told me they would pull me from the experience moments before the end. So I calmly stood there beside my friend and stared to the sky above to watch it all unfold. The sky appeared to be on fire, the entire sky. The blue sky and white clouds had been replaced with a glowing fire of red and amber flames that appeared to be slowly descending to the ground. As the flames neared the high-rise buildings and the tops of trees, they burst into flames from the heat, slowly coming towards us. It was evident that there was no escaping this catastrophe, and we were merely seconds from it being over. In those last moments, I embraced my friend and hugged her, knowing this would be the end, and began to weep for the end of humanity. In those last few moments of life, I became fully aware that nothing in this world mattered except for love. Love for each other was the only thing we possessed that could save us from our own destruction. No amount of money, technology, or material things mattered in this world but love. Love was the only thing that truly mattered in life, and in those final moments of enlightenment that I experienced, I blacked out. I felt like I was in a small box, or even an orb. For a brief moment I sat in complete darkness, and then a computer screen lit up in front of my face. It looked like an old 1990s computer monitor booting up a DOS sequence. The lettering of command prompts being executed came out in bright green computer text. With bits of yellow and red text commands mixed in, it looked like a computer rebooting sequence. The moment only lasted a few seconds and was too fast for me to read what the command line said on the screen. Seeing the computer screen and the command prompts immediately sent my mind reeling. That this entire experience was a computer simulation. Was what I experiencing at this moment simply a computer simulation to show me what had happened to our society? Or was it much more of an indication that everything we experience in our lives was as a result of a computer simulation? I was suddenly back in the timeline where I had been a moment ago. This catastrophe I was able to witness was over. As I stood there, the high-rise buildings everywhere were still smoking in ruins from the intense energy that I had witnessed, destroying them. There was no wind, and for as far as the eye could see were plumes of smoke from the destruction that had hit the city. When I looked around the neighborhood, all the people that were running for their lives a moment ago were gone. There was no trace of them, as well as my friend. I was now all alone. I guess having gone through the experience of living in this post-apocalyptic world lessened my emotional distress at this moment and allowed me to simply accept what seemed to be inevitable. I stood in a moment of silence, reflecting on how life was before this Armageddon was unleashed, knowing my memories of that world would never be as strong as they were right now. Over time, these memories would fade, and I would struggle to hold onto them like grains of sand in my hands as they slipped away. I knew there were far less people on the planet now, and that there was no time to delay heading south to escape the coming winter. It was late summer, and in order for me to survive, I would need to pack up some essential items and prepare for the long journey ahead of me. I recalled picking up a worn-out backpack and grabbing any essential items I could find in the garage, including the first aid kit, a road map, and a compass. There was absolutely no hesitation in my actions to prepare to leave this city on foot, and as quickly as possible. All the vehicles were dead that hadn't been burnt to a crisp, and that would make the journey more daunting. When I woke up from this alternate timeline, I found myself weeping uncontrollably from the experience. The intense emotion of love that I'd felt holding my friend in our final moments together really impacted me. How much love was the only thing that truly mattered in our world. For years, our society was based on materialism and competition, to the extent of it evolving into global conflict in order to feed this desire. How far had we fallen when it came to loving one another unconditionally? As harsh as this alternate timeline was, and the experiences I would have to endure, a theme of love and hope lay buried in the rubble of this shattered world. When we are conceived, it was done through the love that a man and a woman have for each other. When we are born into this world, it is the love from our family and the community we live in that ultimately determines our ability to develop and thrive in life. Love is something that has no expiry date and doesn't depreciate over time. Each and every one of us has the ability to share our infinite supply of love with the world throughout the course of our lifetime. Hope, on the other hand, provides a beacon of light in the darkest of times. It motivates us to overcome the most difficult challenges laid before us and inspires others to keep going, even when giving up seems inevitable. Much like a brush fire is needed to open a pine cone to release its seeds for reforestation, perhaps this Armageddon Unleashed that I experienced was done to release the seeds of love and hope into the world for a new generation to start all over again. For all I know, maybe this experience was a wake-up call for us all to restore love and hope in our world, and to put an end to the conflicts happening on the planet before it is too late for us all. This concludes my high consciousness experience of Armageddon Unleashed. This broadcast and the content is copyrighted, all rights reserved. No part of this media publication may be reproduced, distributed, or transmitted in any form or by any means, including electronic or mechanical methods, without the prior written consent of the copyright owner. This publication is a work of fiction. Names, characters, organizations, places, events, and incidents are either used in a fictitious manner or are fictional. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, actual organizations, or actual events is purely coincidental. For rights and permissions, please contact the author